Hey Anna, I've got a little drapery demo for you. So based on your rendering, I've made a rough sketch. I know it's not exactly the same pose, but I think it'll still be applicable. So I always start, as per usual, I'm going to space in some of my shadows. This is the direction I'm choosing for my lighting. The shadows are always going to be deepest and darkest where the fabric is scrunched up the most. So as it comes out of what I think are gathers across the shoulder line, gathers out of the arm's eye into the sleeve, and especially where we're seeing the gathers and also the like hanging drape over the belt. I'm using Payne's Gray for this. And notice that I'm letting like a little bit of like the sag of the fabric hang out past the belt. That helps show that like the belt is gathering it in. And I'm not afraid to block out whole areas, like most of the sleeve in darkness based on where the light's coming from. I have a little bit of gel medium in this to help me kind of work in a few layers of translucency, so that allows me to kind of get these wishy-washy layers in, and then I'm going to start darkening some things. So you want it to come, since it's kind of coming out from underneath the belt, mostly dark right where it hits the belt, little areas of folds that are then sort of flaring out into softer shadows as they get away from the source of whatever's gathering it. And then we get a few deeper, larger folds along the hems of things, if you think about that like ripple. And you can kind of tell how, like, in this instance, I'm thinking of it being pulled to the left-hand side. So we have the most directionality of folds from that area, and the tightest, darkest folds of shadows are over there, and they're sort of like pulling towards it. I also implied some movement that is probably not useful to you, but I like putting them in movement. I'm using a little bit of the I've got the exact color Bordeaux red with a bit of gel medium in it to just sort of glaze my high tones. I've waited till that's entirely dried. I've got the violet, a little bit of gel medium, and I'm gonna just quick glaze most of this down to the local color. But since the gel medium's in there, we're going to get some areas of that red coming through. We're going to get the shadows coming through. I'm using a larger brush for this part since I know I'm kind of covering a large area. It does make the edges a little messier, but I can clean those up later, and it helps me not have so many brush strokes in my layer. So this is the rounded filbert. So you can kind of see how the different layers are building up. That transparent layer of purple went over the darker Payne's Gray is giving us nice shadows. When it's going over the red, it has a warmth that shows it sort of coming into the light. But we've lost some of our dimensionality, which is what we're going to work on adding back in now. I did add a little touch of the Bordeaux into the violet as I was kind of creating more layers. Kind of dims it a little bit. It's a little primary. It's not a primary color, but you know what I mean. So here is just a little bit of that Payne's Gray coming back in. I'm working with a smaller brush now, proportional to the wrinkles that I want to paint. So you might want an even smaller one if it's more like a pleated fabric. I'm working with a little bit more like a rough gathered idea here. Still keeping my darkest shadows there and letting them kind of feather out. Since I've been using gel medium and I'm not waiting on this to dry in between, I'm acknowledging that it will do some automatic blending for me, especially as I get less direct buildup of paint on my brush. So when I'm like putting my brush down, it's as dark as it's going to be, and it's going to start blending as I pull out. I've mixed that Payne's Gray with a little bit of violet, so it's like more of a neutral. And by neutral, I mean to our local color, not an actual neutral color. Less punchy. I'm mixing a little bit of the violet in and a little bit of glaze medium, and I'll use that now over some of our medium areas, our kind of mid-tones that are heading into the warmth. Which means I need to clean my brush off in between. I'm also mixing a touch of the mauve in, which has some pre-mixed white into it. You'll see that I use that in the mids. So we're sort of sculpting, we're carving it out. It's gotten dark now, so we're using that mauve that has a touch of white. We're using a little bit of that Bordeaux for warmth, and we are creating our midtones and that like arc from the deepest shadows into our brighter highlights. Since we have a smaller brush, we're also cleaning up edges, adding definition and structure. It's starting to mute down a lot of those redder tones that we were using in the warmth of our midtones and highlights as we were sculpting in underlayers, but it's still peeping through in a few places, and I think that that helps support the storytelling. I've got white with some glazing medium, knowing that everything underneath this is still wet. It's going to be much more subtle, so I don't worry about mixing it before applying it because everything on the page is still wet. We're working with glazing medium that's slowing my dry time. I've mixed just a little bit of the mauve into my white with glazing medium as I'm working on the top here, so that it's just very subtle as we're working in. On the sleeve, I'm looking at less tight gathers, so I'm letting that have bigger, softer shapes, not as angular. When you're working with pleats or something that's more tightly gathered, you're going to end up with more almost angular, right next to each other, high contrast folds. If it's a softer, like easing into a shoulder seam, you can have something a little bit wider, a little more painterly. See what colors I used on that. It's the ochre, but it's the darker one. Oxide yellow I'm using on the base for both the trim and the belt. And then I'll be using some of the deep yellow mixed with a touch of white for the highlights. On these, I'm cleaning up the edges. I'm adding that kind of like soft folding dip motion that we like to use to emphasize like the way it curves around the body, right? Putting a trim on something also means it's not the same width all the way across. It gets, you know, maybe skinnier or thinner as it disappears into the fold and wider again as it comes back out to us. And I keep my brush moving around the form. So I'm not going up and down, I'm using kind of carving strokes. So that little bit of white with some yellow on it helps to bring forward some areas, adds warmth and a highlight that helps pull the folds into the foreground. I'm using a little bit of the burnt sienna to add extra shadows into the golds of these areas. Everything's still wet, so it's mixing, it's layering up. That oxide yellow has a very brownish hue to it, but still reads as yellow, so that sienna helps kind of flash it into a goldier, warmer shadow. And having multiple layers of this helps it come to the foreground. Your yellows tend to be less opaque. So they need a little extra help. Having the white and that highlight certainly helps make it more opaque as well. But I don't mind the purple showing through in areas that have more shadow especially. So I hope that that helps. A little creation there, and good luck.